Welcome to the Action Network podcast presented by FanDuel. We're back with our experts guide to betting series. This is the NHL edition. I'm your host, Maria Marino, joined by Action Network NHL experts, Michael Leboff and Nick Martin, also hosts of our hockey betting podcast, Line Change. Fellas, how we doing?
Pretty excited. Happy to be back for this one. I was on this last year, and Matt decided to bring me back for year two, so that's always good. And I'm happy, obviously, to have my partner in crime, Nick, along with me for this one.
I was expecting a little bit more of an enthusiastic, response. Nick, what do you got?
I think Mike just nailed it too hard last year. So, he's like, why am I back doing this again a year later?
We are going to raise the bar. Before we get into best practices for betting NHL, I just want to find out what makes you an expert on betting hockey. Mike, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I've been doing this for quite a while now, probably a decade, and I've been running Action Network's NHL arm for half of that time, I would say. And as just a hockey fan in general, I'm very familiar with the sport, kind of the ebbs and flows of it, know what to look out for as actual trustworthy signals against what's just noise. I know how the media and kind of just natural biases can kind of impact betting lines. And I think the other thing is I've learned who to learn from, if that makes sense. Like folks like Nick Martin, who's along with us here, and some of our other action analysts, other people in the space as well. And I feel like I'm pretty good at identifying those people and learning from them, and being able to take what they do best and blend it with some of the stuff that I do well. And all of that has added up to me still here doing this.
Nick, how long have you been betting on the NHL?
So I've been going at it for about 8 or 9 years. I've been a huge hockey fan my whole life, grew up playing hockey. So about 8 or 9 years, and then about 5 years where I've really been serious and really understood how things work, and been a level beyond what I would say is kind of a casual, and where I really merged a good understanding of hockey with a good understanding of how to handicap at a high level.
And I also want to say one thing about Nick, and kind of ties this all together, is that the way that Nick and I met kind of is something that I always look for in bettors as well, and people who provide betting content, which is he reached out to me. He saw that we were looking for freelance help in a article on Sportsnet from Elliot Friedman. He reached out, and the way that he talked about hockey immediately just told me that he knew what he was doing. He was someone who could break down a game both from like an analytical perspective, and also just talk about it as someone who obviously has a good eye for the sport as like a coach and a fan. And so he's able to take those elements and mesh them together. Like I don't think anybody else in the space usually have someone who's good at one or the other, and Nick is actually good at both. So I'm here to make sure that I can pat him on the back for that.
Isn't that sweet? Well, look, I think it's pretty obvious that you both bet this sport pretty often, but just to clarify, just how often do you bet NHL, Nick?
Yeah, I'm at it pretty much every night during the year. Every now and then I'll take maybe a little time here or there, but I do find that comes with a bit of a setback, where I really think my best is when I have a pulse on everything and I'm really paying attention and watching a ton. So it gets to a point where it's a bit of a grind, obviously, but I think, to do the absolute best I can within reason, I try to do it every night and really pay attention the whole time.
You as well, Mike?
Yeah, unfortunately, I spend most of the hockey season betting on hockey, and it is a grind. And I do try to, if I can take a break reasonably, I'll do it. And I think Nick and I would both say, like, towards the end of the season maybe is a good time to maybe step back, because just the way things kind of shake out with regular seasons, it gets a little difficult. And then weirdly in the playoffs, when there's just like one game a night, is actually not a terrible time to take a break either, because if you don't have anything there, you could end up just forcing it. So sometimes, you'll pick a spot to take a night off, if there's like a Monday night where there's just one game or two games and there's nothing there. But it's basically every night from October to June.
That's dedication. So how can a regular listener out there actually become good at betting the NHL? What does it take for casuals and fanatics alike, Mike?
Well, the good news is that the NHL market is a lot softer compared to the NFL, the NBA, college football, basically any other sport that Americans tend to bet. The NHL is probably at the bottom of the list, which is, it sounds frustrating for a fan, from a fan perspective, but for a bettor, it's good news because it means that bookmakers aren't as quick to adjust. They aren't paying attention to everything. You know, by saying that, I'm not saying like you can catch bookmakers sleeping on money lines for like a game, but the derivatives of, you know, player props and stuff like that, that all kind of works to your advantage here, because you can beat a bookmaker to a soft line on a player prop. If maybe some guy got scratched or there was a trade or something, you can do it in the NHL. Whereas like in the NFL, since it's just nonstop 24/7, 365, the people setting the lines are on the ball with just about everything. So realizing that is important. And then of course, getting used to just general betting 101 concepts that you can then apply to hockey, whether it's, you know, trying not to chase steam, making sure you're getting the best number, shopping around, knowing the ebbs and flows of a season, taking it into consideration, stuff like rest and schedule spots, travel, all that kind of stuff. But like I said, the good news is like if you're on the ball with that kind of stuff, you stand a legitimate chance, especially compared to the NFL, the NBA, college football, etc.
Nick, anything you want to add there? And when or how do you think you developed from sort of casually betting to truly understanding the landscape of the NHL?
Yeah, I think I always had a good understanding of the sport, but when I developed into like a much stronger handicapper was when you really get into all the good stuff with bankroll management and all those good things that really do matter. You're definitely, they're all very important. And I think it was kind of when I really had that understanding of like just getting the best numbers, how lines move, how those are going to pay off in your ultimate edges, where nobody's good enough to win, like especially betting sides on the NHL and all sports. Obviously, it's the same for NFL and NBA. No one's good enough to win without claiming those best lines, without getting on things early when you know the prices are going to move and that sort of thing. You just can't cover that in this day and age. So I think once I kind of got into a place where I understood those things and really found a way to make sure I got money in at the right times and that sort of thing to create the greatest edge, is when I started to really get somewhere with it.
So guys, help us establish a foundation for betting this sport. Nick, you mentioned having a pulse on everything that's going on. What are the other pillars that we need to know going into this?
Yeah, I think Mike touched on what I would even say, that there is still some soft lines with sides on the NHL and specifically props, like he said. But with overnight bets, if you really keep a pulse on it, there are lines that are just so soft where I would say with a high degree of confidence, it's just wrong. Like it's just off what the actual number should be. And you can really pick apart those numbers if you bet early. And getting to the point where you understand enough things to really get which numbers are off is a really complicated conversation. That's where you truly need to understand all of these little intricacies of the sport. But I think you can get there. And one of the reasons it's the best to work at is that the NHL does clearly have some softer lines than other sports. I mean, I couldn't pick them off at other sports, but I do think that with my vague understanding of, you know, the NBA and the NHL, or NBA and NFL comparatively, it's just not the same, where you know that they've hung a bad line.
Yeah, like in the NFL, for example, if the Jacksonville Jaguars are playing in London, like the next week, the bookmakers are not, they're going to know that, right? And they're going to make sure that they're going to adjust for that travel. Whereas in the NHL, like you'll have situations where a team is on its fourth game in 6 nights and they just traveled from Nashville across the country to Philadelphia, and maybe they're playing the Flyers, who aren't good, but that's a great spot for Philly, right? Like, and it's because it's the NHL, that adjustment's not going to come until the morning when the quote unquote real market opens up and the big money bets come in on let's say an underdog like Philadelphia waiting for a favorite traveling across country in a bad schedule spot. So as Nick said, like identifying those spots the night before and betting into them is really important. And you'll hear some professional bettors talk about how it's tough for them because they're trying to bet big money. But for recreational bettors who are listening to the show, like you can get your bets down the night before in the NHL, and you'll beat the market if you can identify those spots, and whether it's like a goalie's change or maybe there's going to be a star player who got nicked up in the game before or something. You can beat the bookmakers and the market in the NHL. Whereas, yeah, if Aaron Rodgers got hurt in the NFL, or just someone saw him sneeze on the sidelines, like the next week that number is going to be adjusted.
So betting early is key. This is why Line Change, which is Action Network's hockey betting podcast, hosted by the two of you, records and releases twice a week the night before the slate. Very good to know. Any other fundamentals we missed, Mike?
Yeah, I would just get very familiar with some of the predictive metrics that Nick and I like to use, which is it's funny because soccer and hockey end up being very similar in handicapping. And you think about two sports, and there's not all that much in common, including the surface that is played on and the number of players on the surface that it is played on. Expected goals is probably the most important one to start with. That's usually where Nick and I build off of. That kind of tells you what team is generally tilting the ice in either the right or wrong direction. And we tend to look at 5-on-5 metrics much more than we'll look at special teams, because it's just a lot more volatile when you bring those things in. Of course, teams can profile well as with a great power play, and that helps. Of course, Boston, Toronto, these kind of teams have had terrific power plays in the recent past, and you have to adjust for that. But for the most part, for most of the teams in this league, you're looking at 5-on-5 numbers like expected goals and shot attempts, high danger chances, stuff like that, and seeing do their actual results match up with their predictive metrics, and if not, is there a reason to it? If there isn't, maybe that's a team that'll be under or overvalued in the market. So trying to keep an eye out for trends like that is quite important in betting the NHL and in other sports, of course, as well.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, I would tie in on that, where I would say it's awesome because you can use expected goals as a guideline in the NHL, but I don't think it's foolish to think that you can spot your own edges, where like you've watched a team 3 or 4 games in a row and you really believe you have a good feel of where they're at. And that comes with time, but that is one of the things where, like, when I do this every single night, that there's a confidence with feeling like I understand where a team is coming from. And I think that's one of the really interesting things about betting the NHL, because I don't know if that necessarily applies a lot to many other sports. Like, I think if you're watching baseball and you're saying you have a feel for where a team's at the last couple games and that sort of thing, and you think you have an edge there, that's probably not true. Whereas, like, I think the NHL, you can kind of see where a team's trending if you've watched their play for a week or two, and sometimes try to pick out a good spot based off that. And a lot of times the analytics will tie in with that, right? But
well, Mike, you started to touch on this with expected goals as a statistic, but what are the most important tools, resources, and other data points that you and Nick use on a nightly basis? And, what should be in your toolkit as a sharp hockey bettor?
Yeah, the first thing is to just get familiar with what do these odds mean, right? Like -150, what does that actually mean in terms of what am I betting? Well, you're betting a team. Does the team win over X%, or do you think a team is going to win over X percentage of the time? So once you get familiar with like implied probabilities, I think then you can start to build in other kind of betting tools, if you will. In terms of stats, expected goals, we use it all the time. I look at stuff like shot attempts, team like save percentage against expected save percentage. And, we'll have a conversation about goaltending a little later, kind of marrying everything together. Like, is a team's defensive metrics just being propped up by a goalie who is standing on his head? We saw this with the most recent Stanley Cup Stanley Cup playoffs with the Florida Panthers, who had everyone was talking about how well they were playing defensively, but because they weren't letting up many goals. But when you actually watch the games, and this was a point of that Nick made throughout the entire their entire run, was they were having defensive breakdowns. Their goaltender was just bailing them out. So when you kind of marry together like high danger chances and save percentages, and as a goalie just red hot right now, and making those high danger chances go away because he's playing out of his mind, or vice versa, the team's doing well defensively, but a goalie is not playing up to snuff. Like all those things kind of marry into one big portfolio that eventually, if you're just starting out, will make sense, right? Like you'll figure out a way to point out signals through the noise and what's real, what's not. But just understanding those basic concepts of under and overperforming metrics, and what, like Nick was saying, using your eyes. Like you can trust, if you're a hockey fan, you can trust that you can spot a team that's playing well or playing poorly for 3 or 4 game samples. So all these things kind of marry into one big toolkit, I guess, if you will.
Sticking with this theme of basic concepts, I'll admit, as a newbie to betting, and in particular with the NHL, I had to realize there's no spread betting. So can you just briefly explain like what that does and how you're just going off win probability?
Yeah, I mean, it depends how you want to look at it. Like the majority of NHL betting is on money lines, and that's where you're gonna probably live the vast majority of your bets. But I also think this is a fun area to tie together, like Mike was saying, with I think there are unique spots where you can play reverse puck lines profitably and play some puck lines. It's one of those things that takes time, and you're just going to tie that into your overall understanding of the probability of the NHL. So it's a money line sport mainly, and I know, I just think there are some really good times to work in different opportunities. So the puck line, a standard puck line is -1.5. A lot of the times these come down to empty nets. So it's a whole new bet, and it's a whole new kind of world you're getting into when the vast majority of puck lines are going to get settled on an empty net, which is close to 50-50. Your whole bet's going to come down to one moment at the end of the game in the final minute and 30, which is interesting. And yeah, I just think it's one more thing to understand where you're going to try to decide whether you'd rather play a team straight up or with a puck line. In general, they're going to have a similar eventual value. Sometimes the way I'll do it is especially with an underdog, if I think it's a spot where they could really show out and maybe a letdown spot for something like a home favorite, maybe I'll get on a reverse puck line where you get a really long price. And then the other way bets work in the NHL is 3-way money lines are quite popular. And I actually really like 3-way money lines, which is just where tie is a result, away team win is a result, and home team win is a result. And it's just another way to get a slightly better price on a home team. But like I said, it's going to run with a similar eventual value to just a regular money line. Some people just don't want to lay -220. So you might play a 3-way money line for -150 instead. But realistically, from the vast majority of my research, I've just found that they run to a similar value.
Mike, what kind of unique challenges does the NHL present from a betting perspective?
Yeah, there's a lot. For one, the NHL is a sport that is played on ice with a bunch of guys skating around with knives on their feet, and there's 2 goalies at either end. So it's just incredibly random. It's one game of hockey is about as random as you can get when you consider the environment that these athletes are playing in. So that's one unique challenge. And as Nick and I will explain, like these challenges, you can also use these challenges to your advantage, which is, to play into that variance more often than not. Number 2 is just the lack of media coverage and news compared to the other sports, which once again, like you can use to your advantage, but understanding what lineup ins and outs mean in the NHL is a little bit more difficult to quantify than saying the NBA, where the rotation is a lot different compared to hockey. It truly is, it's a cliche, but it is a team sport, and one player for as a general rule of thumb, there of course are exceptions, isn't going to have a gigantic impact on a betting line. But when you are starting to deal with a cluster of injuries and then another guy gets taken out, then things start to get a little bit more dicey to figure out, and you can kind of catch the market overreacting at times to stuff like that. But where it really does, and Nick can explain this better than anybody I know in the space, is coming down to goaltending and understanding the rhythms of an NHL season and kind of the general rules of thumbs that every NHL team follows when it comes to their goalies.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example of where you can just find so much value on the NHL. The goalies is the easiest example because a lot of the times with back-to-back, I shouldn't say a lot of times, about 90% of the time or higher now, teams will not go back-to-back with their starter. So right away, if you see a line that's 5.5 and it doesn't really make sense, it looks like it has to be a team implying their starters going the next night. A lot of times you can get an easy half goal on a total, sometimes even more, where all you're doing is assuming that the starter's not going to go back-to-back, which I think it's a really good example of where it's annoying for more novice bettors because you aren't going to have confirmation on these sorts of things. But I think it's actually a good thing if you're going to view it that way and use it to your advantage more often, where you're going to be the one making the assumptions. And over time, you're going to find out all the little intricacies that'll help you do this more accurately. But I think it's just another one of those things that lets the NHL be such a good sport to handicap because, like we've said with the NFL and that sort of thing, you're not just finding these easy and obvious ways to get a little bit of extra value with your bet.
And another thing to keep in mind there too is kind of leading into that narrative is the NHL media is, because it's not as robust and I guess competitive is maybe the right word. The, for lack of a better word, again, takes are a little off. So some goaltenders who were very good 6 years ago are still talked about in as if they're in their salad days. Jonathan Quick is a pretty good example. Marc-Andre Fleury is another one. And you'll see you will sometimes see the lines move favorably towards these goaltenders, like Jonathan Quick still getting respect from the market as a number one caliber goalie when we know he's not. And so if let's say that he was still playing for Vegas, if Vegas decides we're not going to start Jonathan Quick tonight, we're going to start our backup, who is a lesser known player, Laurent Brossoit, for example, from this past season. A lot of times you'll see the market be skeptical of Brossoit when it should be the other way around. We know right now that Laurent Brossoit is a better goalie than Jonathan Quick, but because Quick's name has much more oomph to it than Brossoit, and for casual bettors, the number won't adjust correctly, and you can play into that as well. So, but these are things that you will pick up on as you're watching and betting it every day and getting into it. And you'll say like Marc-Andre Fleury's got an 890 save percentage and Philip Gustafson's got a 920. Why is the market saying that the Wild have a better chance to win with Fleury in net than they did when it was assumed Gustafson was a starter? And you can pick off line value that way too.
Yeah, and the last one I'll say just for props, because it is so much my bread and butter, is that in the NHL, prop markets don't get adjusted as much as other sports based on absences. So you can pick off these ones where midday, say someone's going to sit and you know for a fact, and this is where you're really going to have to study and like obviously you need to have quite an understanding of the game. But once you hear someone's out, if you can understand who that benefits the most very quickly, you can try to get on someone's lines. With shot props, the majority of it is just how much time they're going to play. So there's a lot of easy picks there once someone's out, if you can just assume who's going to get the bump in ice time. And obviously that's a big part of prop betting with the NFL and with the NBA. But I just think that odds makers are a lot more on it with those sports in terms of like lines getting cut off. NBA props, if a big name drops out, props get cut off. They reopen later with new numbers that are adjusted. Whereas in the NHL, typically you do have a window where you can try to get some bets in before the news is fully hit.
Nick, hold that thought on prop betting because I want to get into that a little bit more, but briefly want to go back to something you mentioned as far as confirmation, for example, that a goalie will be in net. Can you just touch on, Mike, the sort of media schedule? And also, you talked about the lack of robust media or the less robust media. And do you feel like that makes coaches just have less accountability and then, in effect, information becomes more scarce?
Yeah, NHL coaches and general managers and owners and anyone employed by these teams, they just lie all the time. So they're just not, and whatever, they're trying to get an edge in their own world, and that's fine. But yeah, I think it is less accountability from the media. I don't think that an NFL coach can get away with some of the stuff that NHL coaches get away with, because it would become a national story, be on First Take and stuff like that. And whereas like an NHL coach can just lie to you all season long, and nobody outside of like the hockey sphere is going to even notice it. So as a general rule of thumb, we just always wait for morning skates, which are usually 10 or 11 a.m. local time, whether that's in Pacific, Central, or Eastern. And by that time, like the lineup you see on the ice is almost always going to be the one that you're going to see that night. But if you can, like as Nick was saying before, if you can have an idea of what a coach is thinking even before they confirm it, you're gonna beat the market more often than not. To a goalie change, sometimes to a player being injured, you just want to be on top of that stuff. So if you're betting after the morning skate, it might be a little bit too late for stuff like that. So I would just do everything you can to kind of figure out the rhythms and the coach speak. And just like Nick said, like the rule of thumb with goaltending and certain players as well.
Well, going back to props, Nick, how has the increased popularity of prop betting impacted the NHL market?
I think the increased popularity, hate to say it, but it is a bit of a bad thing, right? Odds makers are spending more time setting these lines. They're paying attention more. So it's going to be a little tougher to get an edge. The perfect example of this is come playoffs. I do worse on props in playoffs. It's been 2 playoffs in a row that have been like that, because you're just not finding these cheap edges that you are in the season, where it's just, like I said, those instances where someone's bumping a line or that sort of thing. So I think that's really it. There's some fun new markets. So from a more casual perspective, it is nice to, whereas sometimes in the NHL, you couldn't exactly bet on all these things. You couldn't bet on some of the more unique stuff like power play points and that sort of thing. But that's probably just the greatest change, is the increased popularity has led to bigger handles, which leads to more attention and sharper lines being set.
And as Nick was saying before about the eye test and how you can use it to your advantage. If you're watching a team, let's say like Tampa Bay during the playoffs, Nick and I both really like to play on the Lightning during the 2023 Stanley Cup playoffs. Michael Eyssimont, who they picked up very quietly from the San Jose Sharks in a very low key trade. They made another big splash in the trade market, but this one flew under the radar. And people who were diehard hockey fans knew this guy as a volume shooter, and he's probably a little bit better than his usage. Like he should be getting bigger minutes, and perhaps the Lightning identified that. So he was a guy that we targeted when he played as a good anytime goal scorer prop, as a over in terms of shots on goals, because we knew who Michael Eyssimont was and what his ceiling was before the market did. And it's much harder to do that in other sports. Like everyone's going to see the breakout wide receiver coming in the NFL. Everyone's going to see this, an NBA player who's starting to get more minutes. Like people, that stuff gets noticed. In hockey, it's much more subtle. So if you can pick up on things like that and see like, hey, this guy's getting, bigger minutes on the power play. He's starting to, he might be the next guy in line if a top 6 winger gets hurt. You can get to that stuff before the market in the NHL, which really helps with the prop markets, which, as Nick said, like they're starting to pay more attention to, but it's still the NHL, so you're gonna have a bigger head start compared to the bigger sports.
Mike, would you say the same sort of logic applies during the NHL offseason? And is there anything in particular that we should stay on top of during that time?
I think so, yeah, because a recent example would be that Nick and I, as we wrapped up our season of line change for 2022-2023, we had a conversation at the end about how the Devils were set up to become they were already a short price. They were one of the top 5 favorites, but the buzz around the Devils was that they were going to be pretty aggressive in trying to fill out the rest of their team. They were maybe 1 or 2 pieces short of being a true elite team in the league, and they've already done that as we speak now. and the two of us that had a conversation about, we think the Devils are going to end up as maybe the favorite or co-favorite to win the Stanley Cup by the time the regular season starts. We talked about some other teams down the board as well. And that's just being in tune with the league before anyone else. Like, how many people do you know are paying attention to the NHL offseason? I don't want to assume, but I'm going to guess it's probably a lot less than people who can tell you what, Aaron Rodgers' favorite restaurant is in New York City, right? Like, it's just not going to be a lot of people in your life. So if you're one of those people, you stand a chance of understanding the landscape and which teams are set up to make a jump, and beat the market to that jump before a big move is made, before they sign a free agent, etc.
Right. The news cycle in an NHL offseason does not seem to be nearly as active as it does for, say, the NFL or NBA. All right. A couple more quick questions for you guys before we wrap this up. How would you describe just an ideal betting opportunity heading into any given NHL game, Nick?
I think I'd have the same answer as Mike, which is just whether there's one team that maybe hasn't had ideal results lately, or they're facing off a team that's heavily overvalued, and it just sets up as a spot where the number has gotten way too long. You can see where these teams are in terms of the kind of results that they should have been getting compared to what they have been getting. And that happens so much in hockey where the game's so random and a couple bounces will decide every outing. So, and I mean, I think that's the same answer you'd probably get for most sports, but just one where you're finding one team that's undervalued relative to who they're playing. And sometimes they coincide perfectly, and you get a number that's really good. And this also ties into what we were saying with the bets a night before, where most of the time those spots will pop out really quick. You'll see the opening numbers come out and you'll know that right away you really want to get on that. And sometimes the line value that you will gain in the NHL is kind of absurd. Like, it really only compares with other niche sports. Whereas like in football, I'm seeing bettors talk about it's crazy if they gain like a whole point and a half. And you look at what that actually means in terms of where the money line moves to from where it was, and it's not comparable at all. Like, the NHL is regularly 40 cents, 50 cents, and that can just come with nothing happening. That can just be money pouring in on one side, and this odds makers realizing probably where a number should have been to begin with.
Mike, would you agree that you also have to decipher just the results, and what about the box score might be fluky?
Yeah. Nick put it pretty much perfectly. And you can throw schedule spots like the one I alluded to before about a team maybe playing a very busy schedule, tough schedule. Maybe they just ran a gauntlet. There's some parts of the NHL schedule that are notorious for teams from different parts of the country. For example, I'm on Long Island. For the Islanders traveling out to like the Pacific Northwest, when they play Seattle, Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, and then they're coming home, like that game at home shouldn't really have a home ice advantage, depending on, if the other team is kind of playing a more normal travel schedule. So stuff like that, I always love to bet into. And like Nick said, if you pull up a team and you look at their last 10 games and you see, and especially if it's a smaller market team, let's say the Senators or something, and they're losing 8 out of 10, and 7 of those losses are 1 goals or overtime, you can tell that this team is probably better than that 2-8 record. And maybe they're playing a team that has more name brand recognition, whether it's Tampa Bay, Boston, whoever. And maybe the opposite's true for them. And you've noticed like this team isn't playing as well as their record portrays. And when those two teams collide, that's my favorite thing to jump in on. And it's not a hard or fast rule that bet is going to win, but more often than not, you'll get a good number.
What about live betting? How do you both approach that? Nick, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think so. Live betting on the NHL, the main play that I'm looking to target is live sides, and it always involves a team that's trailing in a game. So just getting a long number on a team that's trailing, particularly late when the algorithms are really ramping up quickly. And in particular, certain teams, depending on their ability to play with the goalie pulled and that sort of thing, that's kind of the main spot I look to target. Obviously, to be profitable live betting, you do need to have a heightened edge because they are taking extra juice compared to a normal bet. So you need to factor that in when you're doing regular percentages. Like, I think a good example would probably you don't want to do too often is 5 or 6 minutes into a game, you look at how a team is playing and it's 0-0, and you think now you've gained enough edge and enough knowledge from that 5-6 minutes of play to jump in. I think that's tough. But yeah, I do think that the NHL, again, probably has better live edges than some sports.
Mike?
Yeah, I would agree with Nick. I don't know anybody whose live betting strategy is to bet the team that goes ahead in the NHL early, because you're gonna pay a significant tax, and it's such a random sport. And as we saw last season, that being the 2022-2023 season, there were more multi-goal comebacks than basically any time ever in the NHL. Scoring's up, that increases variance, and all that stuff kind of dominoes into one another. And like Nick, if you're watching a full NHL game, you should, if you're listening to this, if you found this podcast, you probably have an idea of like the rhythm of a game, and you can tell if a team maybe is on its heels a little bit despite being up 3-1 or 2-1 late. And I would just trust your instinct in those spots, because even though you're paying a tax live betting, no matter what, like there are comebacks in the NHL all the time. Teams score in those last 2 minutes all season long. And if you think you can identify those spots and you feel it, like I think you're more than okay to trust yourself if you've been watching that entire game and have a good feel for it.
Let's end on this. Nick, for you, what is the ultimate thrill betting an NHL game?
I'd stick with where we're at and just say betting on a team that's losing to come back and win the game. You're obviously taking a really long number. So if you bet on a team down 2-1 or whatever with 7 minutes left and they tie it and come back and win, I think those are the most fun bets. You got to be careful not to do them too much and try to make sure you still have an understanding of like what the actual percentage chance of that happening is. But I don't think it gets better than those live bets where your team's coming back from behind.
Same for you, Mike?
Yeah, for me, it's I love betting big underdogs in hockey. I love watching them get a multi-goal, maybe a 3-0 lead, blowing that 3-goal lead, and then hanging on to win, maybe in overtime or getting a late goal. That's my favorite. It happens very rarely in an NHL season, but when you get to touch every emotion, which is the euphoria of backing a plus 275 underdog, watching them go out to a 3-0 lead, then you get to go all the way to the bottom of the pit, watching them blow that 3-goal lead, and then right back up to the top by them cashing the bet. That's hockey in a nutshell. The swings are outrageous, and that's when I truly feel alive.
Well, this has been the Action Network podcast presented by FanDuel, our experts guide to betting series NHL edition. For Michael Leboff and Nick Martin, I'm Maria Marino. Guys, where can anyone listening follow you?
You can follow me in the Action Network app at Leboff M. My Twitter is the Big Lebowski with 2 E's. Nick and I both host our Action Network hockey betting podcast, which you named before, Line Change with an exclamation point. And yeah, that's really it for me. And of course, you can find me at actionnetwork.com. I also write for our partnerships with the New York Post and Philadelphia Inquirer as well.
Nick, what are your handles?
I'm on the Action app at Nicholas K. Martin, on Twitter at Nick M_hockey. And all of my writing on game guides and day-to-day lives on the Action app as well.
Yeah, if you haven't already, you gotta download the award-winning Action app. There are so many tools that you can take advantage of, including market reports. Also, be on the lookout for our other expert guides to sports betting, with episodes being released throughout the summer right here on the Action Network podcast presented by FanDuel. Thanks again for listening.